CNT125, Chapter 8, we're continuing on with VLANs. With managed switches, your switch is typically pre-configured with one default VLAN, the admin VLAN. This is a VLAN that can't be deleted, can't be renamed, and usually all the ports on the switch are by default in that VLAN 1. That's typically what's there. From there, I create additional VLANs and put ports into them, etc. We can do static VLAN assignment where we assign ports to the VLAN, or I could do dynamic VLAN assignment where I would assign maybe by MAC address they belong to a certain VLAN. Now, dynamic requires the support of like software or a server to help with this. We are going to focus on our static VLAN assignment in our labs, just for simplicity at this point. But just be aware there is a dynamic VLAN assignment, but it requires additional equipment, additional software to do so. Here is a show run on a switch showing a handful of ports already in VLANs. VLAN 10 here, VLAN 20 here, and then a number of ports that are in by default VLAN 1, if you will. That's what we're seeing there. Here is a number of ports in default VLAN 1, and I have some ports in VLAN 10 and VLAN 20, staff and student, if you will. Those are the VLANs that were added and ports taken and put into those VLANs. That's typically what gets done, and that's one of the first things we'll do when we configure our switches. Now, the switches can have access port or trunk ports, so let's talk about that. The access port, and we typically will configure that. We'll say switch port access, and that we're setting it as access mode, or switch port mode trunk as opposed to access. So we have access and trunk that we can do. So let's talk about that. With access mode, this is typically for a workstation or an endpoint to connect to. So if I'm setting these VLAN 1 ports as access or VLAN 2 ports as access, this is designed for devices like desktops or phones, IP phones, to plug into them. Meanwhile, if I configure a port for trunk, that's for another purpose. Here would be some access VLANs. When I say switch port access VLAN 10, I'm setting this to access mode. So a device or something is going to plug into this port. Meanwhile, if I do trunk mode says that this port here is going to VLAN tag or do frame tagging so that this can connect to another switch usually or router. This is designed when I configure a port for trunking that I'm going to connect this switch to another router or another switch, to a router or another switch. So this is going to now start frame tagging everything as, hey, this came from VLAN 10, this came from VLAN 20, this came from VLAN 30, so it can share that with the other switch or the router. That's what that means. This comes from the days of phone where you would have a trunk line that goes from like a neighborhood, an entire neighborhood, back to the central office. That's where the term comes from. You're combining multiple phone conversations across one line back to the central office. So in our switching world, all of these VLANs, VLAN 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. This switch port connecting to another switch, trunking would be done across there. In other words, it's going to do frame tagging. It's going to do the IEEE 802.1q frame tagging to tag that traffic as belonging to VLAN 1, VLAN 2, VLAN 3, etc. Here on our switch, this port over here, gigabit 101, switch port mode trunk. Right there it is. When we say trunk, it's turning on frame tagging. It's going to frame tag all the traffic leaving out that port and read them as they're coming into that port. Here's an example of two switches connected, maybe second floor, first floor. We have VLAN 10, 20, 30, 10 for wired, 20 for phones, 30 for wireless users. As that traffic comes into these switch ports, the switch starts tagging them as belonging to 10, 20, 30. It'll share that across this trunk line. This trunk line right here, this fiber optic line connecting the two switches, is going to frame tag all of that traffic. So as it moves across here and gets the other switch can read those frame tags to know, oh, this goes to VLAN 10. Oh, this goes to VLAN 20. So when I say trunking, I'm also implying that we're turning on VLAN frame tagging. That's what's going on. Now, the book also mentions VTP, VLAN Trunk Protocol. Now, I like to put a disclaimer out there right away. This is kind of this I don't want to say it's confusing, but it's kind of misleading. For the longest time, I thought when I was learning this, oh, this is when the trunking happens, blah blah blah. What really is happening here with VLAN Trunking Protocol, VTP? This allows you to have one switch be the server switch, if you will. When I make any VLAN setting changes here, the client switches can copy that VLAN database. That's what this is really for. This is really for if I need to manage multiple switches, I can do one main switch and it copies that VLAN information to all the other client switches. That's what this is all about. So VTP is used to copy VLAN databases on the VTP server switch to all of the VTP client switches. So if I have, think of HAC's Harrisburg campus, the main switch, maybe the main switch is in the student center. All the other buildings, I might do a similar VLAN structure for wired users, for wireless users, for IP phones. I might do that same database table, VLAN database table, on all the other switches in the buildings. If that's the case, I could configure the main switch in like the student center, and all of the switches in the other buildings would copy that VLAN database table. That way I could make change to one switch and the other 4 or 5 in my campus would get updated from that. That's what VTP is really about. That's what VTP is really about. Okay, so just keep that sorted in your brain there. With VLANs, here we have VLAN 1, VLAN 2, VLAN 1, VLAN 3. Remember, between the switch and the router, these are typically, each of those VLANs is typically its own subnet. So thinking back to earlier this chapter when we did all that subnetting, we would start allocating a subnet per VLAN is what we would do. That's typically what's going to happen. So we would literally say, this is a trunk port here, if you will. Actually, this is I think they're showing you a router port on this one. But I have VLAN 1, VLAN 2, VLAN 3. I'm literally allocating subnet 1, 2, 3. So it looks like this right here is our reminder. One broadcast domain equals one VLAN equals one subnet. Typically, all three of those are tied together. This gets accomplished on a router with sub-interfaces, which again we're going to do. We're going to do some VLAN configuration, we're going to do some subnet configuration, then eventually we're going to take those two pieces and put them together like I would have in a real network. So here in their example, they had VLAN 1, VLAN 2, VLAN 3. So I would allocate a subnet 10.0/27, so 3 bits borrowed, going up by 32s. 0 subnet, 32 subnet, 64 subnet. So I would allocate a unique subnet to each VLAN, and then each sub interface on the router will get allocated that VLAN in that subnet. That's how it would work, and it would look something like so. On the router, I would break it into 3 logical sub interfaces, which we will do, and I would allocate a subnet to each one. VLAN 1, subnet 1, 10.1, that's the first usable. Subinterface 2, VLAN 2, subnet 2, 33 is the first usable in the 32 subnet. And then over here, subinterface 3, VLAN 3, subnet 3, 65 would be the first usable IP address on that subnet. And that's how I would do that. I would allocate the 10.0 subnet, 32.0 subnet, or 32 subnet, and 64 subnet, and these would become the first usable addresses on the router interfaces. That's how that gets implemented. This is typically how I work with my VLANs, and my subnets are typically going together in a fashion like that. And again, we're going to work our way up to that. We'll do the VLANs first, then we'll do the subnets, and then we'll put them together. The book mentions a couple VLANs that we have. Default native data management voice. Default is the one that's already pre-configured. That's there. It's there by default. I can't delete it. Typically everything is assigned to it. What you typically do is add VLANs and put ports into the new VLANs you create. These would be the default VLAN ports that are there, everything belonging to the default VLAN 1. And what you typically do is when you add new VLANs, you take ports and put them in that VLAN 10 or VLAN 20. You take them out of VLAN 1 and you put them in the new VLANs you created, 10, 20, etc. Native VLAN, again, typically this is the default VLAN, and you might see that as we start configuring, we'll see native VLAN. And we typically want to create new VLANs and pull ports out of that default VLAN and into the new ones, and not rely on this VLAN 1. Data VLAN, this is typically when I'm moving data through a workstation, moving browser data, email data through, be a data VLAN. We also could have a voice VLAN. We will do this a little bit later this semester as well. As we hook up some IP phones, we are going to add a voice VLAN, and as you see here, we actually have a voice VLAN sitting on top of a data VLAN. That's what this access VLAN 20 here would be, a data VLAN. The voice VLAN 10 is a voice VLAN sitting on top of that one. And that's a sneaky thing we do when we hook up IP phones. We'll show you how that works. Allows you to stack those two on top of each other so that I can cable my phone and my computer up in a specific manner in our offices. When we do a show VLAN command on our switch, it'll actually show you the VLAN number, name, and any ports that are associated with it. That's what we end up seeing. We're going to do that a lot when we configure our switches. We'll do show VLAN, and we can even do, and this is the show VLAN off of one of our lab switches. We'll see here the VLAN number 10, name student, and any ports associated. VLAN 20, name staff, and any ports associated. That's what you get with a show VLAN. Show run will show you also the VLAN membership, but it also shows you trunking too. You don't see trunking in the show VLAN. I'm going to go back here a space. You won't see that here. It's not showing up there anywhere. But when I do the show run, I'll see the trunking. So we'll typically do a show VLAN, show run to see both of those pieces. Last but not least, a little troubleshooting. Troubleshooting with VLANs. Common problem, ports in the wrong, basically ports in the wrong VLAN, and they might be in an access mode when they should be trunk and vice versa. Incorrect VLAN assignment, and maybe ports in the wrong VLAN and they're isolated off. So back here again, show run, show VLAN helps you track down where ports are, what they should be, whether it should be an access mode or a trunk mode. And then what we can do to fix them is either, switch port access VLAN and put the correct number in to move it over, or switch port access mode trunk to put trunking on when it should be if it's not there. We can usually run the same command and fix whatever the error is. That's typically what we do. So there is VLANs in Chapter 8.